Greetings and welcome to the Just Wage Forum 2021. My name is Dan Graff. I'm a faculty member in the History Department at the University of Notre Dame, where I specialize in the intertwined American histories of work, politics, race, and gender. I'm also director of the interdisciplinary Higgins Labor Program, named for Catholic priest, labor economist, and union advocate Monsignor George Higgins. Our outfit explores questions about work, the politics of work, and the work of social justice, all through the lens of Catholic social teaching, which emphasizes principles like the dignity of work, the right of everyone not only to decent work, but also a voice at the workplace, and a commitment to the common good. We're housed at Notre Dame's Center for Social Concerns, where students, faculty, and staff collaborate with community partners to fuse the efforts of the head and the heart in the cause of social inclusion and justice. Thanks for joining us today. The Higgins Labor Program's major research project is the Just Wage Initiative, which probes a foundational question rooted in Catholic social teaching. What makes any given wage just or unjust? The major fruit of that research is our new Just Wage Framework and online tool. You can see the link showing on my screen right now. It's a resource for professors, policymakers, and practitioners to reflect and dialogue upon just wage questions, and hopefully to come away committed to contributing to a fairer, more inclusive, more sustainable, indeed, a more just economy. Our Just Wage Framework consists of 7 interrelated criteria. And over the first half of 2021, we're hosting experts drawn from the scholarly and practitioner realms to share their insights, expectations, and concerns regarding the prospects for a more just economy. Meeting mostly every third Friday, with the start time varying to accommodate the busy schedules and disparate locations of our esteemed panelists, we focus on one of the 7 just wage criteria at each session, with short presentations by both a scholar researcher and a practitioner activist, both in the spirit of bridging the academic and advocacy realms, and in the hopes of starting not only new conversations, but also new initiatives. We kicked off the forum on February 12th, where we introduced the Just Wage Framework and heard a great talk historicizing conceptions of the living wage from economist Don Stabile. 3 weeks ago, we focused on Criterion 1, a just wage facilitates a decent life. And we had wonderful presentations by Thalia of the Economic Policy Institute on the need to raise the minimum wage and the urgency of restoring workers' bargaining power, and Notre Dame alum Stephanie Garakanian of the Workers' Defense Project on the campaign for paid sick days in Texas. If you missed either of those first sessions or would like to revisit them, you can access the videos from the Just Wage Forum website. Our next session after this one, on April 9th, 3 p.m. start time, which is a little bit different than what we've been doing, is devoted to Criterion 3, a just wage provides social security. And we're looking forward to presentations by sociologist Andrew Schrank of Brown University, Executive Director Clayton Sinyai of the Catholic Labor Network, and a response by our own Emily Marola, who's currently a research associate at Notre Dame's Lab for Economic Opportunities and was formerly a student research assistant here at the Just Wage Initiative. I hope you'll join us and spread the word. But today our focus is on Criterion 2. A just wage enables asset building. As we frame it, a just wage offers disposable income, enabling savings and property ownership. It provides benefits in the form of educational enrichment, professional development, and skills enhancement. And it promotes opportunities for advancement and income growth. More broadly, a just wage also facilitates community development. I encourage you to visit our website to learn more about this criterion and all the others, as we've put together a series of resource pages organized into the following categories. What does Catholic social tradition say? What does research show? What is the law? and who does it well. In a few crisp paragraphs, each resource page introduces the topic and points the reader to more resources for deeper exploration. I should mention that who does it well, we're having an issue with that web page right now, but the other three are up and available for exploration. Before I turn to the main event and our speakers, let me say a note about protocol and participation. We'll devote about 20 minutes each to presentations from our featured speakers, followed by 15 minutes or so of a conversation between them and a member of our Just Wage Working Group. We'll then still have nearly 30 minutes for conversation and Q&A where the speakers will answer questions from the attendees. To that end, we ask that you use the Q&A function along the bottom tray of your screen to raise questions or comments during the presentations and afterward. We'll do our best to prioritize and address as many as we can. And for those we don't get to, we can always follow up outside the session via email and the like. Thanks for joining us today. And thanks to all my many colleagues at Notre Dame for helping make this Just Wage Forum possible. Well, today's first presenter is my great colleague and friend, Clemens Sedmak, professor of social ethics and director of the Nanovic Institute for European Studies at Notre Dame's Keough School of Global Affairs. Professor Sedmak is also an advisor to the Center for Social Concerns in Catholic Social Tradition and my co-conspirator in launching the Just Wage Initiative. A native of Austria, Clemens holds doctoral degrees in philosophy, theology, and social theory. And he's held multiple faculty and leadership positions at King's College London and the University of Salzburg, in addition to Notre Dame. He's the author and editor of several books, including, just one among many, The Capacity to Be Displaced, Resilience, Mission, and Inner Strength. He's unparalleled, in my view, in his intellectual inquisitiveness and his collaborative desire, and he's been the driving force in pushing the Just Wage Initiative forward from its inception. He'll speak on a right to the future, asset building, and a decent life. Clemens, thank you and welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dan, for the kind introduction. Thank you for having me. Welcome all. I was given 20 minutes, actually I was given up to 20 minutes to talk about a right to the future, asset building, and a decent life. I'll speak on March 19th, which in the Catholic calendar is St. Joseph the Worker, which is a very good day to talk about just wage and also to talk about asset building, since the Catholic social tradition believes in the primacy of work over capital. So asset accumulation should not replace income generating labor. I want to use my time in 6 points. I would like to talk about Form I-944 in my first point, talk about definitions, distinctions, and functions in my second point, talk about Catholic social teaching thirdly, present a case study in my fourth point, ask the question just assets, and finally talk about assets and integrity. So my first point, Form I-944. One of the humiliating elements imposed by the US government on applicants for the green card is Form I-944. It's called Declaration of Self-Sufficiency. Number 9 of this declaration asks the applicant to list his or her assets. The instructions to the form says, assets. List only the assets that can be converted into cash within 12 months. Provide the value of any asset held in the United States or outside the United States in US dollars. If you or a household member owns a home, you may include the net value of your or the household member's home as an asset. The net value of the home is the appraised value of the home minus the sum of all loans secured by mortgage, trust deed, or other lien on the home. If you wish to include the net value of your or your household member's home, then you must include documentation demonstrating that you or the household member owns it, a recent appraisal by a licensed appraiser, and evidence of the amount of all loans secured by a mortgage, trust deed, or other lien on the home. If you list assets or resources, submit evidence of the value of your or your household member's assets. You must include the name of the asset holder, a description of the asset, proof of ownership, and the basis for the owner's claim of its net cash value. Evidence of assets and resources include checking and savings account statements, annuities, stocks and bonds, retirement accounts and educational accounts, net cash value of real estate holdings, and any other evidence of substantial assets that can be easily converted into cash. End of quote. 5 lessons can be drawn from this form. Number 1, assets increase a person's self-sufficiency and reduce the likelihood to depend on monetary support systems paid for by taxpayers. Number 2, there are different types of assets based on cash convertibility, here on a 12 months criterion, or tangibility. There's a difference between real estate holdings or stocks and bonds. Third, important types of assets depend on financial institutions and financial infrastructure, such as checking and savings accounts, stocks and bonds, retirement and educational accounts. 4, ownership and control over the entity is key in the case of assets. That's why you have to submit a proof of ownership. And finally, assets values change over time. That is why you need a recent appraisal of the net value of your asset. So this was Form I-944, which tells us a lot about assets. Secondly, some definitions. Assets are stocks or resources that can be accumulated and held over time. Assets are entities over which ownership rights are enforced by institutional units and from which economic benefits may be derived by their owners by holding them or using them over a period of time. There are different categories of assets. Sometimes the social science literature distinguishes between physical assets, such as land and real estate, financial assets, such as stocks, savings accounts, retirement accounts, social assets, such as social capital, and human assets, such as cultural capital or education. I will focus in my brief remarks on physical and financial assets, assets with financial relevance. Functions. Assets have 2 main functions. A, they allow to deal with risks and contingencies, so they reduce vulnerability and strengthen resilience to shocks and stresses. That's the first function. They allow to deal with risks. The second function is they provide for future consumption and allow to make plans for the future to embrace a long-term perspective. So reduce vulnerability and allow for long-term planning as the 2 main functions. These 2 functions can be translated into the avoidance of poverty traps. Poverty traps are situations that are structured in a way that people cannot get out of poverty, which in turn leads to the intergenerational transmission of poverty. If you have to spend 100% of your income or even more every month to meet necessary and minimal expenses, you will not be able to change your financial situation. Thus, assets can help to break the cycle of poverty. Without assets, families may be able to subsist day to day, but will not be able to cope with a financial emergency, save for their children, or invest in a better future. Assets cushion a family from income disruptions through illness or accident or layoff, and unexpected, unavoidable expenses such as a car repair or a medical bill. Asset poverty means exposure to risk without the ability to cope. In 1991, Michael Sheridan published his book, Assets and the Poor. And he made the point that without assets, it will be almost impossible to achieve financial security. Asset ownership also changes the way people think and see the world. They are willing to take risks, for example. So the idea of asset building replaced or at least challenged the income paradigm in the analysis of poverty. Since the 1990s, we have a global asset building movement. In a recent paper by Kate Bird for ODI, the Overseas Development Institute, it was shown that assets are really a major way out of poverty. So these are some definitions, distinctions, and my 2 functions of assets. Third, Catholic social teaching. As Professor Graf mentioned, the just wage framework is based on Catholic social tradition, and our criterion number 2 dates back to Catholic social teaching documents. I will mention a few of those documents and will make basically 4 remarks, what Catholic social teaching has to say about assets. Just one preliminary remark. In Catholic social teaching, just wage includes the possibility for savings. Wage levels have to be, and I quote from Centesimus Annus, which is an encyclical from John Paul II from 1991, the year Michael Sheridan published his book, by the way. Wage levels have to be adequate for the maintenance of the worker and his, I would add her, family, including a certain amount for savings. So wage levels have to be adequate for the maintenance of the worker and the worker's family, including a certain amount for savings. If you look at Catholic social teaching documents, you could see that assets have four aspects that you can extract from the documents. First, assets are motivators. They motivate work and dedication and commitment. Rerum Novarum, the very first social encyclical published in 1891 by Pope Leo XIII. Rerum Novarum section 5 says, it is surely undeniable that when a person engages in remunerative labor, the impelling reason and motive of his or her work is to obtain property and thereafter to hold it as his or her very own. So the assets serve as a motivator. The idea of assets as private property serves as a motivator for work and for certain commitments to work. The same encyclical also makes sure that people understand that the law should favor ownership. The church has always held up the right to private ownership, and assets in this case serve as a major motivator for work. Second aspect, assets are liberating. In the compendium of the social doctrine of the church, we read in paragraph 250, a wage must allow for savings that will permit the acquisition of property as a guarantee of freedom. Isn't it interesting? A wage must allow for savings that will permit the acquisition of property as a guarantee of freedom. All of us who are interested in the capability approach, in the idea of real capabilities as freedoms, will like this paragraph quite a lot. Assets open up freedoms. The same document, the compendium, talks about savings as linked to free decisions by customers and consumers, and enhances this connection between assets and freedom. So that's the second aspect. First, assets are motivators. Second, assets are liberating. Third, in Catholic social teaching, and that's a little controversial, I could say, assets are connected to a particular lifestyle, Rerum Novarum talks about living sparingly. So, with modesty and not wasting money, not be wasteful. I mean, the same document also talks about living comfortably. And I think that's the easy acceptable quotation. Rerum Novarum 46 says, if a workman's wages be sufficient to enable him comfortably to support himself, his wife, and his children. I apologize for the sexist undertones here. That was the language of 1891. So if a workman's wages be sufficient to enable him comfortably to support himself, his wife, and his children, he will find it easy if he be a sensible man to practice thrift, and he will not fail by cutting down expenses to put by some little savings. So here you see an expectation of a certain modest, humble lifestyle that is not wasteful. So simplicity as an important idea of the lifestyle connected to asset building stands. You would find the same in another document, but I will not quote it. So these are three aspects of assets in Catholic social teaching. They are motivators, they are liberators, and they are connected to a particular lifestyle. And the last aspect is a matter of distribution. In John 23rd's encyclical Mater et Magistra from 1961, we read, the economic prosperity of a nation is not so much its total assets in terms of wealth and property as the equitable division and distribution of this wealth. So total assets, not so much in absolute terms, but also in terms of its distribution and its accessibility. So there is a justice issue, an issue of distributive justice connected to assets. This was my third point, 4 aspects of Catholic social teaching. Assets as motivators, liberators, connected to a particular lifestyle, and also a matter of distribution. Now, I'm in 11 minutes, 45 seconds of my 20 minutes. I turn to my point 4, a case study. And the case study tries to exemplify the importance of assets, comparing the Homestead Acts of 1862 and 1866. I'm not a historian, so please don't ask me any historical questions, but I find this Homestead Act development really fascinating. The 1862 American Homestead Act was signed on May 20th, 1862 by President Abraham Lincoln and became law on January 1st, 1863. This Homestead Act gave 160 acres of land to settlers, 21 years of age or older, and usually American citizens, who were willing to cultivate the land for at least 5 years. Yeah, I skipped that. And my first keyword here is asset access facilitation. Make it easy for people to access assets, and there is a governmental role as was recognized in 1862. There was a heated debate leading up to the legislation, including a May 1860 veto by President Buchanan, who rejected the suggested Homestead Bill on the grounds of justice. The president saw it as unfair to old settlers who had paid for the land, unfair to veterans who had received land as service compensation, and unfair to non-farmers. Furthermore, President Buchanan was worried about the spread of demoralization, a sharp rise in land speculation, and a decrease of government revenue. So let's call this asset fairness as a concern. Nevertheless, the law was signed by Abraham Lincoln 2 years later. Access to assets was also controversially discussed with regard to the labor market and the wage system. Industrialists worried about cheap labor. Southern state representatives were concerned about the future of the plantation system. Let's call this, in a neutral language, asset suspicion. Some concerns about what will happen to the labor market and to our current power structures if people have access to assets. The Homestead Act was definitely a major asset building policy in American history. One can see many advantages. The Homestead Act contributed to democracy and state building, encouraged migration with new agricultural techniques, promoted a long-term perspective, supported small farmers, added to economic growth, ensured an adequate food supply, encouraged the cultivation and protection of unpopulated land, and the building of tangible infrastructures such as roads and railroads. So let's call this asset-based progress. There were, however, significant downsides, which point to the larger questions of justice with regard to asset distribution, asset appropriation. In some less fertile lands, 160 acres turned out to be insufficient to sustain a livelihood. There were challenges of overproduction and preservation of land, issues of overgrazing, for instance. But most importantly, the Homestead Act contributed to dispossession of Native Americans and their lands and further exploitation of Native Americans. There was also some misuse with speculation and the challenge of distinguishing between bona fide settlers and those with speculative interests. Let's call this asset abuse. 4 years after the Homestead Act, the Congress passed the Southern Homestead Act in July 1866, which distributed land in 5 southern states, Alabama, Arkansas, Florida, Louisiana, and Mississippi, to all Americans, black and white. The basic idea was honorable: to enable former slaves to appropriate income-generating assets that would allow them to build an existence. Legal freedom without material freedom remains a legal fiction. Asset-building policies, such as the Southern Homestead Act, are among the most powerful strategies for creating opportunities and for reducing wealth inequality. Let's call this asset-based opportunities. However, the conditions of the Southern Homestead Act were less than a level playing field, leading to what has been described as asset discrimination, disadvantaging African Americans, a term coined by James Bailey in his book Rethinking Poverty from 2010. The Southern Homestead Act differed from the Homestead Act in that it permitted land to be used exclusively for agricultural homesteading during a 5-year waiting period. However, most of the 46 million acres offered to settlers through the Southern Homestead Act needed the removal of stands of pines in order to make them farmable and productive. Thus, the actual physical state of land made available was problematic. Furthermore, the Southern Homestead Act led to frustrations. Chaotic conditions prevailed in the land offices, and there were a number of racism-related incidents. In some cases, the land ownership of Black people was not legally protected, and their titles to the land inaccurately recorded. Quite often, quotation from Tina Shanks, living on the land for 5 years proved difficult when the Black homesteaders had few financial resources and sometimes had to work other people's land to support their families. James Bailey observed, of the 1.5 million families which received land under the Homestead Act and Southern Homestead Act, only 5,500 of the new homesteads were owned by Black families. Of the 1.5 million families, only 5,500 of the new homesteads were owned by Black families. And this is asset discrimination. So if we look at this, we have our keywords: asset access facilitation, asset fairness, asset suspicion, asset-based progress, asset abuse, asset-based opportunities, and asset discrimination. Which brings me 2.5 minutes of my speaking time to my point 5, which I will shorten a bit, just assets. Our working group is called Just Wage, just as in justice, but just also as in only. The same applies to assets. Assets are a matter of justice, but also only assets is not enough. You need an infrastructure. You need a financial infrastructure. In a paper from September 2015 in Econometrica, Douglas Burnham and co-authors discussed the role of self-control in savings, both as an internal psychological mechanism or as an externally enforced commitment. Other papers talk about the importance of having the possibility for formal saving accounts. In Germany, Friedrich Wilhelm Raiffeisen in the 19th century was famous to open up those possibilities to low-income families, access to formal saving tools. This will allow low-income families to have the infrastructure needed to be able to have savings. So let me end in my last 1.5 minutes with a point about assets and integrity. So I talked about Form 1944 and 5 lessons we can draw from that about assets. I talked about the 2 functions of assets, reduce vulnerability and open a future perspective. I talked about 4 aspects of Catholic social teaching with regard to assets, presented my case study on the Homestead Acts with 7 keywords, asked this question about, made the point assets is not enough, it needs an infrastructure. And I will close with the connection between assets and integrity. As Professor Graf mentioned, this is Criterion 2 that we're discussing today. Last time we talked about Criterion 1, a decent life. The Just Wage framework forms a coherent whole. So Criterion 2 is of course related to Criterion 1. Asset building is part of the idea of having a decent life. If I look at the connection between assets and integrity, I can see a connection to prudence. Assets offer the possibility for a long-term perspective. I can see a connection between assets and hope. There is with assets that justify hope that things can change. Ray Bojaro once observed even small amounts of assets can generate large stocks of hope. So assets provide hope for the future. Third, assets help with the ability to make promises. If I know that I have assets, it's easier to get a loan from the bank and my trustworthiness in those kinds of circles increases. 4, assets enable my expression of robust concern, the possibility to build wealth that can be passed on, and also to break this dynamics of transgenerational transmission, intergenerational transmission of poverty. 5, there's a justice issue, a major justice issue, as we have seen looking at asset discrimination. Since assets can be increased and accumulated and put to work to obtain more assets, it is easier to make more and more and more on the base of assets, which is why inclusive asset building, as Michael Sheridan and others describe it, is key from a justice perspective. And finally, assets enable personal growth because life is more than just survival. You want to be able to build something. Concluding remark, after having briefly talked about the connection between asset and integrity, there is a beautiful biblical passage in the book of Joshua, once the people of Israel settled in the promised land. And in chapter 5, verse 12, we read the manna. And you remember the manna was the food given by God to the people of Israel in the desert. The manna ceased on the day they ate the produce of the land, and the Israelites no longer had manna. They ate the crops of the land of Canaan that year. That's Joshua chapter 5, verse 12. And I find this fascinating because it says if you have assets like land, you do not depend on manna, be it manna from God, be it manna from the government, be it manna from donations. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Professor Sedmak. And our second featured speaker is really a pair of presenters, both from the AFL-CIO Investment Trust Corporation, what you might call the institutional asset building wing of the American labor movement. We're grateful that they've both taken time from their busy schedules to join us today. We'll first hear from Notre Dame alum Randy Kinder, who you now see on the screen, president of the ITC, the Investment Trust Corporation, since 2019. Over nearly 2 decades, Randy has overseen strategic marketing campaigns for the $5.2 billion AFL-CIO Building Investment Trust and the $8 billion AFL-CIO Equity Index Fund. Randy will introduce us to the work of the AFL-CIO's Investment Trust Corporation, and I turn to him now. Randy.
Thank you, and thank you, Dan. Thank you to Higgins Labor Program for having us here today. It's good to be home. I don't mean in my attic. I mean on the virtual campus of Notre Dame. I certainly wish we could be there in person and look forward to doing so very soon, perhaps for another one of your programs in the future. Now, today I'm going to describe a few of the vehicles that the AFL-CIO has created with investment partners to help the wages, the fair wages earned by union members work to build personal retirement assets. Now, we do so in many ways, but all of them reflect worker values and create jobs. So what I hope you'll see from the things we describe is that the links: job creation, community building, attention to fees, low fees, because this gets into some of the stuff that Clemens was talking about fairness and equity among workers, those who traditionally have not been involved in asset building, finding ways to make sure they're getting a fair shake, and overall promotion of worker values. Now, my colleague Thalia Lankin, who did not go to Notre Dame, I'll keep mentioning that, by the way, and I'm going to talk about 3 of these vehicles, and specifically we'll dig in on a couple issues that we believe are important to understand what we're trying to do at the AFL-CIO. Now, we aren't the only games in town. I want to let you know that quickly. We have friends at other organizations, including Flco, the Union Labor Life Insurance Company, and other managers who are working to push vehicles that have these same types of values for labor. We do represent the ones that the AFL-CIO has specifically put their name on. Another vehicle that we're not going to talk about today specifically is the AFL-CIO Housing Investment Trust, because we don't work on that specifically. However, we both, Thalia and I, worked for the Housing Investment Trust for many years, and so during the conversation after and the questions, we're happy to talk about the HIT as well and how that started out, to give some more history to the AFL-CIO's role in this area. And let me thank in advance. I'm not turning slides, but Brett Beasley from the team is going to be working with me on this. So Brett, I apologize to you in advance for me jumping around, but we can get started. The ITC, just so you guys understand who we are and who we work for, we were created to be a service provider, basically to be a link between the labor movement and managers that want to work with our retirement assets, our health and welfare assets, and find ways to invest them in ways, as I described, that comport with our values. Now, on our team specifically, we handle labor relations, investor relations services, and we also raise money through our subsidiary broker-dealer. Now, this is a point of personal pride. I would love to show our team. Everyone on this team has worked in this industry for a good part of their careers, some of them both inside and on the outside of the labor movement. The folks who work on our labor relations are represented on this page as well. We all participate in the AFL-CIO's staff and retirement plan and the health and welfare plan as well. So this is what we live and breathe. And many of these folks could be doing the same work elsewhere and it's a lot more lucrative on Wall Street and other places. But I show this to show you that what we do is inbred is inside of us. We share the morals of the people we work for, and we don't forget every day that every cent that comes into us comes from workers and the work of workers. So we can move on to the next page here. So I wanted to show you a short video that gets to the heart of why we do what we do and how some of the investments that the AFL-CIO has licensed really affect people. You're gonna hear from a man named Daniel Garcia. Now, Daniel's a member of the pipe fitters in Chicago. It's a UA Local 597. It so happens that his union's pension plan actually invests in one of the programs we're going to discuss, the AFL-CIO Building Investment Trust. So what he describes really gets to the fact that his work is directly impacting his retirement and creating more work. So it really gets to kind of the virtuous cycle that we try to put together through some of our real estate investments. So Brett, you can go ahead and show that video.
name is Daniel Garcia. I'm with Pipe Fitters Local 597. I've been a member of Local 597 for 24 years. My father was a fitter. He had me apply, and that's where he went. Being a member of the union, especially 597, it gives me an opportunity to be part of a project that once it's done, I'll be proud of. I've been at Wolf Point for a little bit over a year, and my duties there are, as far as a foreman and as a fitter, is to install all the equipment that's gonna temp the building. We installed all the stackables, the equipment. We tie into them. We rigged it. We actually laid out, and so on. The importance of what I do here is as much as when you walk into a building and you want to feel comfortable, and you do not want to be overheated or too cool. We are the ones that actually make that happen. That you're going to be comfortable as soon as you walk into a building. We produce that. We are part of that. Being a union member and working on these projects, besides giving me a comfortable living lifestyle, it has given me an opportunity to have experienced something that one day I could show my family and say, hey, I was in that project, I was part of it, and it looks good. Something that I would like to say about Wolf Point is that it's something different. I got to see a little bit of different things, actually being part of what actually was a hole in the ground to what it is right now. It takes pride. It feels good, and it's looking good. I believe the misconceptions that they have is that it doesn't take much to do what we do. But once they actually see how it's done and actually be part of it, they would understand that with the right training, you can make this thing happen, and it end up looking beautiful. One advice that I would give to somebody who's thinking of joining the union is that if you are interested in taking pride in something and getting the right training, this is right for you. Being part of a project that one day you're gonna drive up with your family and say, yes, I was part of that.
All right. Thanks, Brett. Mr. Garcia, I think, is a perfect encapsulation of why we do what we do. As I said, his work creates money for the pension fund, which then gets invested into projects. Oh, so there we go. It's invested into projects that he gets more work from, and his brothers and sisters and the pipe fitters get work from, and the rest of the building trade as well. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Building Investment Trust. Now, this is intended to be at 30,000 feet on this. I'm going to rush through little things, but I just want you to get the gist of a few of the different things that we're doing. So again, the Building Investment Trust, you can go to the next slide. Quick overview of what it is. It's a bank collective trust. Important part of this that I want to share with you is partners. For the BIT, our partners, PNC Bank. And as I said, all of our investors are qualified union pension funds. Now, the objective of the fund, to generate competitive risk-adjusted returns, basically to do well, get market returns while investing in commercial real estate. We can go to the next slide here, and I'm going to get into kind of the basics of who it is, of who we are and what we do. So the fund, as I said, is a core equity real estate fund. It's an open-end. You get the fund structure there, been around for 33 years now. The gross asset value, meaning the total real estate that's represented by the fund, is about $7 billion, with about $5 billion net. And there are 58, I think today it's actually 57 properties in the portfolio across the country. The number there, 247 investors. That's 247 different union pension funds that are invested in the BIT. Now, looking at results in those 33 years, invested in over $74.4 billion of real estate, over 200 different real estate projects since the fund started. That translates into millions upon millions of union construction hours. Gets a return that's with the mark what you want in real estate investments. And a point that I want to spend a little bit of time on, we aren't just creating construction jobs through these investments. The buildings in the portfolio also are managed with union labor policies as well. So the janitorial work, any type of upkeep on the building is done with union contracts, making sure, again, the people working on these projects are getting fair wages and are contributing to a good retirement, health, and the like. I want to make sure that this is working in all facets of it. Give you the next slide, just show you a little bit of what's in the portfolio, what types of jobs, what types of buildings we are working on. Right now, you got beautiful buildings in New York, Portland, Chicago. In fact, they're in Chicago. It's Wolf Point West, which is one of 3 buildings that the BIT, the Building Investment Trust, has been investing in, all built with 100% union labor. Right at if you're Chicago familiar, it's where the river breaks off right downtown, right in front of the merchandise mart. It's just a beautiful building. And then you'll see there, we're also in Culver City, which is a project we actually are just selling right now. And go to the next slide. Work continues. I mentioned Wolf Point. Right now, at Wolf Point in Chicago, the 3rd building, Wolf Point South, is going up, which is going to be the new Salesforce Tower in Chicago. That's a BIT union-built, union-funded project. We have a project also under construction in Seattle, and 2 more on slate for the year, all of which are creating union jobs. And that, sorry, right there, what you're seeing, this is the project in Seattle, the Waverly, that's going up right now. Again, all these are funded with union pension dollars, creating union jobs, and will be serviced with union members as well. So again, making sure that the money is working for ourselves, helping to create good retirements for these folks who work on them. Now, let's move on to the next slide there, Brett, to talk about one of the other pieces we work on, the AFL-CIO's equity index funds. You can go to the next slide on it. So the idea between the index funds, and this is something that Richard Trumka, the president of the AFL-CIO, has been pushing for a long time, and sort of, I would say among friends, it's sort of his baby, is to figure out how we could translate the work that we've done in the real estate space into equities, into the stock market. So in 2011, March 2011, the AFL-CIO with a partner, manager partner, launched the AFL-CIO Equity Index Fund, which was an S&P 500 index fund, invests in that total market there in the index, with two big differences. One, we made sure that the fee was being charged to all of our union pension fund investors and participants was as low as you could get in the industry. 2, every share, every proxy owned by the fund would be voted by the AFL-CIO's proxy vote guidelines. And this is something that Thalia is going to be talking about, I think, in the next conversation. We started out with that fund, and Dan, you mentioned it was at $8 billion. We actually have since moved to a new manager, and now we work with BNY Mellon, big manager, big name out there, and have created even more index funds under the same idea of management. So we're in every different indice essentially, and our voting proxies, according to the AFL-CIO guidelines, finding ways to corral union money at a very low fee, as you see here, a very low fee, but making sure that all those proxies are promoting good governance, which happen to be the same thing as union values. Now, what's exciting, if you go to the next slide here, Brett, that's all in kind of the pension fund investment side. For a long time, the AFL-CIO has been saying, well, how can we move things so that it's more direct investment for individuals? Target date funds. About an hour ago now, President Trumka was on Bloomberg News talking about a new effort that we've launched with some big players in the industry to bring the same type of investment, the same values investment to the individual investor in the defined contribution space as well, since so many of us now, while defined benefit pensions are, we believe, are the gold standard, so many of us are either as an associate to those are put into defined contribution funds, or don't have the option to get into defined benefits. So this new series of target date funds, we work with 401k assets, defined contribution assets, to take the same values of low fees, making sure that our members aren't being gouged by managers out there who could care less about who the end user is. Make sure we're negotiating low fees, able to vote proxies, giving our members, again, a way to actually use their dollars to find ways to get a secure retirement, but make sure that they're investing with their values at the same time. And again, Thalia is going to talk a bit about how that proxy voting really works and the importance of it. I wanted to just give you an overview of a few of these things. You see here again, we have a good partners in this we'll be talking more about soon, but we wanted to make sure that in every facet of how the AFL-CIO is licensing vehicles or working with managers, that we are carrying our values through on it with that aim of creating wealth for our members at the end. So with that, I will end my piece of the presentation, and Dan, I'll hand it back to you and look forward to discussing more.
Great. Thank you so much, Randy. We're also grateful to be joined by Randy's colleague, as he mentioned, Thalia Lankin, the Chief Strategy Officer and Special Counsel for the AFL-CIO Investment Trust Corporation. Devoting her career to socially responsible investing, Thalia leads ITC's efforts to expand its offerings of labor-friendly institutional investment strategies. Most recently, she completed the development of a target date fund series for defined contribution plans, which will be available for investment this year, 2021. And Thalia has agreed to just answer a few introductory questions I have about ways that unions and other progressive organizations use or can use institutional investing to promote socially responsible development. So thanks, Thalia, for joining us, and welcome.
Thank you.
So first, can you explain a little bit about what proxy voting is and how it can bring workers' collective power to bear in these capital markets?
Sure. Yeah, thanks, Dan, and thanks for having me, and glad to be among the Notre Dame family. I feel like I'm associated by knowing Randy, although I have to say I've never been on campus, and I thought this was going to be my excuse. So hopefully one day soon, but happy to be here. I think what Clemens said earlier about asset ownership changing the way you can see the world kind of applies to how I think about proxy voting. I think that there's a good overlay through which labor sees its capital. This pooled capital can be complementary to the assets that a union job helps an individual build for his or her family. So I think taking that lens applies to what Randy talked about in terms of those investments aligning with their interests, creating jobs, building their secure retirement. But there's another asset that workers have collectively when they invest in the stock market, which Randy just talked about, which are their proxy votes. So proxy voting through funds like our fund with Bank of New York Mellon brings labor's collective voice to the table with some of America's largest corporations. For every one of the stocks owned in those collective funds, we vote the proxies, Bank of New York votes the proxies in 100% alignment with a set of value propositions that the AFL-CIO publishes and maintains about how labor can be represented in the boardroom. When we combine our voices, as these funds allow us to do, we make ourselves as workers heard in corporate boardrooms with a louder voice than any of us can do individually. So every working person who invests in your retirement plan, whether it's a pension plan or a 401k plan, or even your individual stock ownership, if you have some, you're in the stock market, you have the right to vote at annual company meetings that comes with the right of that ownership. However, when it's in retirement accounts, a lot of this money is actually managed by investment managers. We as individuals aren't able to vote. Those managers vote on our behalf. But the other piece of this is that shareholders can introduce proposals at annual meetings. So rather than just voting on the slate of issues that are in front of them as shareholders, they can seek to add additional topics to those meetings. These cover all sorts of things, including executive pay reform, diversity, both in the workforce and in the governing board of the companies, workers' rights, political spending, environmental issues, and corporate governance issues. And many of these shareholder proposals over the years have indeed changed company behavior for the better. So that's kind of, Dan, I think how we see proxies from a sort of pension plan strategic standpoint.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks. And so you know, how, just if you're new to this completely as a worker, whether you're a union member or not, I mean, what are ways that working people can get involved to make sure that their shares are part of and their shares in their retirement savings are voted in alignment with their interests. I mean, is it common that people get active and involved, or do we need more people to be paying attention and doing this?
Yeah, I absolutely think it needs ultimate attention, and more attention certainly that it's been getting. I think as you hear more and more about ESG investing in the world, and you see individuals and institutions with capital talking more about these issues, even having groups like BlackRock, who I would have thought 5 or 10 years ago would be socially irresponsible. I think it is a conversation that's going on, but actually getting it to do anything in line with what workers can benefit from, I think takes a lot of effort. First and foremost, I think because there's two sort of forces at work against our voices being heard there, right? First, corporate CEOs, they don't really want shareholders showing up with proposals for their meetings. They want to set the agenda that they want to put forth. They want to get reelected, their board reelected. They want to get their pay package approved, and they don't want any noise in that process. So they've actually worked really hard in the policy arena to make it harder to submit shareholder proposals and even discourage pension plans from voting. Last year, some of those efforts made it pretty far through, SEC and other processes that really could have ingrained this disenfranchisement. And that has real consequences for workers. I think the second thing is that, as I said before, a lot of these large money managers, they just routinely vote with management. No, they don't ask any questions about it. Whatever the recommended votes of the corporate board are, they vote the same way. And too often that means our retirement assets are voted against our interests. So I absolutely think that those two forces require us to pay more and more attention. One of the ways we can do that is by asking a lot of questions and becoming educated, asking more of our money managers. And there's tools out there to help with that. The AFL-CIO has a document called the Key Vote Survey, as well as their voting guidelines that they put out every year. And it shows you how the biggest money managers in the country vote according to those guidelines. So which ones have approved and sought board diversity, for example, or accountability on CEO pay, and which ones haven't. So there are tools out there, I think, that really help us to become more knowledgeable about what's at least the status quo of what's going on. And then there's funds like the ones Randy spoke about, where you can invest with people who do want to have a different voice at the table. And I think that's finding managers or creating the demand at the individual level that would eventually encourage more managers to do those kinds of things is kind of the most important steps we can all take to make these conversations move the needle.
Great. One final question for you, Thalia. There's been a lot of attention paid right now to the Amazon workers union campaign in Bessemer, Alabama. Does proxy voting have any relationship to that effort? Is there any connection there?
Yeah, I love this example, Dan, because I think it actually really brings to life why proxy voting matters. You hear proxy voting and most people just want to fall asleep. You think you're just checking boxes, but it really does matter. So I think what's going on in Amazon warehouse in Bessemer is really important and quite momentous, especially for the labor movement, but I think for workers, regardless of whether they're collectively bargained or not. Workers are exercising their right to vote for a union. And in that conversation, it's bringing to bear what workers face on a day-to-day basis. So to complement that, there's actually at least 12 that I know of really meaningful shareholder proposals being submitted at the Amazon shareholder meeting later this year. The AFL itself is urging adoption of a diverse candidate search policy, which would require diverse candidate searches for employee hiring. This is important because it helps ensure equal opportunity for women and people of color to advance. And especially at a place like Amazon, where you have a very diverse workforce, but you have very little diversity at senior levels of management, a policy like that can really start to change the face of the company. And I thought for this audience, it'd be particularly interesting to note that the AFL is not alone in this. Each one of those 12 actions is taken by some other group. Oxfam America, for example, is seeking that a worker actually get to be represented on the Amazon board. And there's groups like the New York State Common Fund, public funds also join sort of labor's voice in these discussions. And I think one group that I've followed for many years, the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility, they've been a huge champion of these issues and also building collaborations across some of the groups I just mentioned so that all of these interest groups kind of fight together for what can result in a more just company and corporate management. So I think really it's for the benefit of all these shareholders that things like these annual meetings matter. You have a say in corporate decisions, which can make Amazon hopefully a more sustainable company over time, a little more accountable to the communities that they operate in. So I just really encourage everybody to ask questions about how your pension plan, how your 401k plan will vote in this next election. Pick one company, study it, see what the outcome is. You might be really surprised that rather than thinking about what's right for workers, we're essentially with our money further lining pockets of Jeff Bezos, or I forget the name of the next guy who's going to be CEO there, but it really is our money. Even though it's not in our control, we have a voice that we can express to make sure that we hold the managers who do control those choices accountable and force them to sort of think about the fact that whose money they're managing matters, and what they want from that should be important to them too. So
thank you so much, Thalia. I
yeah,
appreciate it. And thanks
thank
to
you.
and Randy. Now we'll turn to my colleague Judy Fox, hear a brief response from her. She's a member of our Just Wage Working Group. She's a professor at the Notre Dame Law School, where she also directs the Economic Justice Clinic, which provides legal assistance to individuals whose incomes make it difficult for them to obtain counsel. She's got an accomplished record of teaching, scholarship, and community-based work, focusing primarily on problems of foreclosures, debt collection, and predatory lending in St. Joseph County, which is where the University of Notre Dame is, but also beyond. And as I know from a great deal of experience, Judy Fox is usually the first name mentioned in meetings of local activists when a new economic crisis or injustice arises in our community. We're delighted to have her here. So Judy.
Hi, well, I want to thank Thalia and Randy and Clemens for those presentations. And I want to sort of touch on a few of the things that were said, and then I'm going to incorporate a little bit of the some questions that have already come up in my responses, and then invite you to do the same. So I think what Clemens shows us is this tension between the Catholic social teaching ideals, this ideal that we want people to have enough income that they can not just sustain themselves, but build assets. That tension with that and the government and market factors that hamper that ideal. And one of the questions that had come up in the Q&A was this notion of how do you account for things like prices and taxes when you're thinking about this. And it leads me to remember a book that was written when I was quite young, but it's actually still very relevant, called The Poor Pay More. And this book, it's a 1967 book, and it's still very relevant today. So what we know is that if you are poor, you pay more for your daily living than the rest of us do, and you pay more in very many ways. One of the ways is just because of where you have to live, you may be forced to buy your necessities, for instance, at the 7-Eleven instead of the discount store, further away because you can't get to it. Because of your transportation. If you try to save your money, you are subject to fees and things in the financial industry that end up eating all your money away. So many banks have policies, for instance, if you don't have at least $500, and we're going to charge you a monthly fee. So pretty soon people who are attempting to save money discover that they're actually going in the opposite direction. If your credit isn't good, you pay more for interest rates, you pay more for insurance, all of those things. And sometimes it's not even your individual credit rate, but where you live, which is very discriminatory, but hard to show. And then there's the other issue of, your time, right? So the poor tend to sacrifice their time for their money. In other words, I can't afford to have somebody paint my house, so I'm going to paint my house. But that takes away from the time that I could be spending working or being with my family or doing other things. So all of those things, I think, are playing into this tension. The government plays a huge role in this tension, and governmental policies clearly favor the wealthy. They favor homeownership over renters, which prevent renters from building assets. We have an unfortunate, extremely long history of discrimination. Clemens mentioned the Homestead Acts, which we're essentially out and out stealing from Native Americans who actually already own the land. But also, we have a history of creating housing policies that prevented people of color from acquiring a home. And a home in America is where most people hold their wealth. And I'm not going to argue that that's a good idea, because I think that that has proven to be not a good idea. Years and years of governmental policy, and again, I don't have time to talk about this, but Richard Rothstein's Color of Law is a great book if anybody's interested, which shows the years and years of governmental policies that have hampered the ability of people of color to acquire that very significant asset, their home. But it's more insidious than that. And again, to refer to a colleague of Katharina Pistor, wrote a book called The Code of Capital, which shows you very much how the way our laws are structured in this country, and it's not just this country, international law plays into this as well, but they're structured to assist the legal profession and their wealthy clients in holding and controlling the wealth in the world. And until you can break through that sort of code of that capital that's out there, it's very hard for the poor to use their income to build assets in any kind of a significant way. And again, that goes back to this whole notion of the poor paying more. It's interesting. I think Randy and Thalia talked about something that's so important, which is retirement savings. Retirement savings is something that many Americans don't have at all. We have gotten rid of the idea of pensions, and I totally agree with Randy that is the gold standard. That's what we should be going back to. It doesn't appear that is where we are headed. And so you have a lot of people who, some of them might have employer-defined programs where they can contribute money themselves. Many of them don't even have that, but they also don't have the knowledge and understanding of how to invest that money, what to do with that money. And the recent calls to privatize Social Security seriously endangers the little bit of savings people have, because Social Security is not a savings program. It's a safety net. It's a disability program. It's lots of other things. So the idea that we would take that and subject it to, sort of the lopsided way in which people understand investments and work on them is a very dangerous thing. There was a brief program, a good program called My IRA that the Obama administration put in, that the Trump administration eliminated, which would allow people to start to build that retirement fund. Because another problem you've got, again, this goes to that whole code of capital problem, is that many places won't let you open a retirement fund unless you can deposit, $10,000 or $5,000, right? So workers were trying to build up those assets, just they're putting them in this bank account that's feeding them to death, and they're losing their money. They never can build up those assets. The My IRA program was allowing people to contribute in those. The money was invested in treasury funds. You were guaranteed a positive return that allowed you to build up to a certain point, and then you could transfer it into another kind of investment. The Trump administration, unfortunately, like many things, eliminated that positive for the poor, that positive program for the low income and for the poor. And so, I don't want to talk too much more about all of the ways in which, and people can ask me questions if they like, all of the ways in which they're hampered, but I just wanted to point one that wasn't talked about, and that is the student loan crisis. So one of the things that our guidelines talk about, our Just Wage Initiative talks about, is to be able to have assets, to build assets, but also educational attainment. And we have so messed up our education system in America that we now have a very tiered system. We have $1.7 trillion in student loan debt out there, which is preventing our future generations from accruing any kind of assets, getting ahead. But that debt is not evenly distributed. So it is very lopsidedly distributed to low income, minority people who attend for-profit schools. That's where most of that debt is held. And so again, we're telling people this is how you get ahead. At the same time, we're pulling back with our other hand and saddling people with debt, which never allows them to be able to acquire assets and move forward and get out of poverty, which is the goal. And my last comment, I promise, because I want to save some time for us to be able to have a discussion. I think the other thing we have to be really, really mindful of and careful of is the tendency to blame the poor for their plight, right? The tendency to say, well, people aren't saving because they don't have the discipline, or they're spending money foolishly. And the fact of the matter is, and this is not my visualization, no, somebody else came up with it, but it's not as if we've got a pie that we can divide evenly, right? Right now, 90% of the pie is already eaten by everybody else. And we get this little sliver left that we're trying to divide up with among most of the world. And to blame people because maybe they spend some money out of television because it's their only form of entertainment is not useful in the discussions. So, and I guess I'd like to just sort of open it up to my panelists to see if they have any comments to add from having heard everybody else. And then, so does anybody have any comments or responses to anything?
Yeah, and as they're getting ready to respond, I'll just jump in and encourage folks to use the Q&A function, and I'll call in our colleague Kelly Reagan, who's going to help with the Q&A. But yeah, please, I saw Clemens raise his hand, so let's hear from Clemens, Randy, and Thalia about any of that, anything anyone has said from Judy on backwards. Go ahead, Clemens, take it away.
Well, thank you, Randy and Thalia and Judith. I was reflecting on the obstacles to assets and asset building, because there's this positive way you look at what happens if people have access to assets, and there's this negative way, what stands in the way of people and assets. And there is this very sad dynamics of the Matthew principle. Those who have will be given more, and those who have little will even lose the little bit they have. And when you mentioned at the very end, Judy, the tendency to blame the poor. And the article I mentioned talks about self-control, which requires a certain stability of life that you can afford this regulatory function of the brain, so to speak. And many people have a life which is a permanent emergency state. And the levels of unpredictability are so high. At the same time, you don't have the assets to get some stability and predictability into your life, which disadvantages people so much. And the last comment, the idea of hope, There was a really interesting decision by the European Court on Human Rights in the case Winter versus United Kingdom, when a severe criminal who murdered 2 people was sentenced to life sentence without the possibility of parole. And he sued against that on the basis of Article 3 violation, degrading treatment, inhuman and degrading treatment. And the judges in Strasbourg really gave him right and said, if there is not a hope that your case will be revisited every 5 years or 10 years, you take away a person's dignity. And one judge even said, to take away hope means to take away dignity. And for me, having a long-term perspective has a lot to do with this hope. That's why I called my little talk a right to the future. And to make it easy for people, comparatively easy for people to have a longer term perspective than just living from one day at a time. And that's where Randy's work is so helpful to open up a longer term perspective, which also ties back to this question of student loans, where you said it prevents people from getting ahead. So thank you so much for that.
Yeah, and I just wanted to, comment just a minute on something that I forgot to mention. I think some of the things that Randy and Thalia brought up are so important to us, which is the idea of those of us who have been privileged enough to have assets in retirement funds or otherwise, to be paying attention to how that money is being invested. And that's not always an easy thing to do, but socially responsible investing is important. And there's a real movement, positive movement in my mind, in the business world right now, moving away from this notion that a corporation's sole duty and responsibility is maximizing shareholder wealth as opposed to an overall social responsibility. And this whole idea that a fiduciary, and I'm speaking now, sort of as the person in our university or your company who is managing this, that their sole responsibility is to maximize return and disregard maybe the moral implications or / immoral implications of the way that money is invested. For those of you who don't have any sense of this, I will do a little bit of a plug for a site called NerdWallet that does sort of evaluate socially responsible funds and can help you sort of get started. But I think we all need to be advocates for investing the wealth or the assets we do have in a way that is not just helping us, but helping society and workers.
Randy and Thalia, you want to get in on this?
Yeah, I'll say something real quick and pass it to Thalia. Judy, bring up a ton of really interesting topics that I would love for us to be involved in future conversations about. But two things. One, you heard us talk about fees a lot, and this goes to some things you both were talking about. In making, trying to get rid of some of those inequities that have been there for so long, and the fact that we all know that those leased off get charged more for everything, right? It's more expensive for an unwealthy person to buy a home than a wealthy person, and so on and so forth. So in the AFL-CIO's investment program, if we call it that, there's always been a strong impetus on fees and lowering barriers to certain things, right? And in the index funds and the target date funds, and as we go into equities, that's going to always be a huge thing. For all the funds that the AFL-CIO has gotten into business with, the different managers, fees will go down over time, never go up, and that's kind of built in to what our conversations with them are. I won't say exactly agreements because there's some legal things there, but with that idea, and of course, with trying to over time in ways that, since the term fiduciary is one that needs to be talked about more, but try to find ways in that low cost setting to have an impact on where the money's going. And in an index fund, the best way is through the proxy vote. Mm-hmm. But we are constantly looking to find new ways to have more of a way to really influence what's going on and where our money's going. And a lot of unions are doing that already. And Thalia, I know you wanted to say something. I saw you take off mute as well.
Oh, I was just going to respond, I think, to something Judith said and to Clemens. I think, Judy, you talked about sort of the returns first versus sort of other benefits, right? And I actually think what's most exciting to me about what's going on right now is that I think it made clear, at least in my view, that corporations maybe were using that as an excuse, right? It was a way to sort of focus first and foremost on their own share class, which then impacted their own pay structure, their own bonus, right? I think when you look at it more broadly, you really end up realizing that what's really cool about the whole ESG and socially responsible movement is it changes the time horizon and the inputs into thinking about what makes the company successful. And that actually then is lined with a fiduciary's responsibility. It's not maximize return tomorrow, it's maximize return for the time horizon on which you're investing. For pension plans, that's 30, 40 years. For individuals in their early years of their life, it's the same, right? And so what's good in tomorrow is not the same thing that's good 20 years from now. And so this whole movement, I think, is really more about redefining fiduciary, not having to put it side by side with something. And I think, Clemens, one thing you said caught my eye, which was this idea about always chasing, sort of the urgency of life as a low-income person. And I mean, we all know here the value of a union, but I think expecting low-income people to do any of those things on their own is impossible. The system is literally built up against them, right? And so what unions do more than anything else, in my opinion, is create that sort of stability and consistency that allows people to think about those other things. If you don't create that space for people, then they can never get to that next level. So I think stepping back from sort of the nuances of a collective bargaining agreement, that really is what the labor movement has always stood for. And I think that's how you can help people move out of this sort of never-ending cycle. So
somebody, now I'm stealing Brett's job.
Oh, no, it's Kelly's job.
Or Kelly's job.
Kelly's here, our research associate at the center. So Kelly, we'll let Kelly field, and you can be one of the respondents, Judy, if you'd like. Kelly, do we have a question from the
Great. Yes, one question is specifically for Thalia, but I think anybody can answer. It's from Christopher Cox. He asks, Thalia, can you suggest what transparency expectations one should have concerning the proxy voting of one's retirement investment?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I think it depends a little bit on what you own and where you sit, right? But you know, if you're in mutual funds, which make up a big part of the world, the SEC actually requires mutual funds to report how they vote on things. So there is publicly available information out there. But let's face it, if we don't have enough time to manage our own 401ks, we probably don't have the extra time to go do that. So I think, you know, we've seen even in the last couple of years, more managers, because of sort of individual-based demand, putting out reports on proxies, kind of bragging about what they're doing in this area. So I think asking the questions and digging deeper and sort of using our other forums, whether it be social media or academic circles, or even talking with your own employer and telling them that you want something that speaks for you in your retirement plan. This is all built up around the sort of individual person accessing this stuff. So I think just demanding it is first and foremost, and then looking and digging on what other managers are doing and sort of trying to get that integrated. It is hard, it really is, but I think those are two specific things that can be done.
Thanks so much. I have another question here that relates to, all of you have touched on these sort of, show us how asset building as a concept, which is, I think, often given short shrift or seen as secondary. Conventional wisdom seems to suggest if you're poor, you need to worry about the here and now and getting food on the table, shelter, clothing, transportation to the job. Asset building can't be in your mind. It seems like that's paralleled at the policy level, where the emphasis maybe is on short-term poverty reduction, even if it's that, for the poor, while asset building, as Judy was getting at earlier, is for those with resources already, like the tax code is written to favor mortgage interest deduction, student loan interest deduction, if you're paying taxes and can get it as a credit. So it seems like the sort of those without assets who we need to be able to get assets to, their problems are paralleled at the ways in which policymakers and maybe the wider public think like we should worry about feeding the poor, not giving them assets. And it seems like a very commonsensical notion that falls apart as soon as you have a panel like this and realize that the time horizon, being able to build assets actually impacts the here and now and how you behave in terms of the immediate future, if you can look to the farther future. So I'm really intrigued by thinking about these time horizons and how we nudge our culture and our policies to think longer term. You know, this gets to Thalia's point about CEOs, but Clemens' points about asset fairness, asset suspicion, asset abuse, asset discrimination. This is so complicated, but so urgent right now. I just ranted rather than asked a question, but I'm wondering, how do we bend that conversation so that people see asset building shouldn't be secondary to a living wage or a decent life, but it's inherently tied up in that. I'm wondering whether it's at the policy level or maybe even at the personal level, where it might be. I'm curious if Thalia and Randy, and talking to union members, if it's sometimes hard to nudge them to, if they're young, to think about the future, because they're also living in the immediate present. So that's for everyone.
Yeah, I would say there's a lot there. I'll mess a bit, but absolutely. I mean, you know, one of the common things we hear from business managers of union locals is, what does their, you know, the new member, right, who comes in and gets that first check, what they do with it, what happens with that first check, and do they understand what they've gotten themselves into as far as the advantage of being a union member over time versus going out and spending the first check on getting that Corvette, or nothing against Corvettes. So that is a constant thing, and something that unions have done again over time. And this is many people are familiar with this, is when you're at the table with management, you bargain for benefits rather than wages, right? And what that has meant in the past, where that's brought us, I think, to a better place than we would have been, but in a place where there's a sense of urgency right now. We were having a conversation the other day about the stark differences between those who have assets and those who don't, when you talk about generational wealth and what that means for someone. You could have two people with identical jobs, the one with the generational wealth, the world is open to, whereas these things hit us each day. I think what we try to do at the ITC and in the labor movement is just to create more avenues to help us through the systems that we have now get to a better spot. But also, and you were just talking about this a moment ago, creating structures within our unions to push these other issues. There's several unions that have extremely active groups that work on governance issues with where their money is going, because there's so much union labor money out there in Wall Street and the like right now, becoming more active participants in that way, and really pushing these issues, making sure that those boards are right, as Thalia was talking about, and that folks are thinking about this and reporting on it and be forced to report on it. These are all things, and also in creation of new vehicles as well. I saw there was a question in the chat about, what happened in the last administration over trying to make it harder, I would say, make it harder for, to create more ways to invest with your values, and what's that meant through ERISA law and ERISA rules and the like. Those rules aren't going to be enforced by this current administration, but there may be opportunities to create more ways to define how retirement assets can be used in ways that are double, triple bottom line, rather than, as Judy was talking about some time ago, which encompass more, that make the lives of those participants better over time. So
I just want to add to what you're saying, because again, if we don't look at this systemically, we can't possibly achieve anything. So most whites who buy their first home buy it with money from their family or their parents. Right? That's just an example of the fact that, so why is the gap between white home ownership and black home ownership, again, the largest asset most Americans have? That's one of the big reasons. And most of our governmental policies discourage the poor from gaining assets. If you get more than $3,000 in assets, you lose your Medicaid. Your Medicaid is much more important in terms of long-term, not having health care, right? So you're discouraged from acquiring any assets. We're so afraid in some ways that people might get ahead that we create all sorts of policies. We don't want to increase, the amount of unemployment benefits we get to people, because, oh my goodness, they might not go to work for $5 or $7 an hour, if they are getting their unemployment benefits, as opposed to allowing them to stay in the situation they are so they can find a better job. There was lots of evidence during the last financial crisis that forcing people into foreclosure, as opposed to doing loan workouts, caused many people to get very low paying jobs out of desperation, where had they had an extra month, they could have gotten a job to sustain themselves. So there's all sorts of those kinds of things out there. We need a complete rethinking of public policy on these issues.
So I'm gonna call on Clemens real fast, and then we have two
really fast. Not just
two more questions I want to get to before we wrap up at 2:30. So Clemens,
no, building on Judy's point and this question of asset discrimination, James Bailey tried to show that the unfairness of the Homestead Act in comparison to the Southern Homestead Act has long-term consequences into the 21st century, where up to a third of the US Americans directly or indirectly benefited from the Homestead Acts, but obviously in a racially divided way. What we see in Europe is now coming up the generation heirs, those who inherit from their parents, as Judy mentioned. parents who bought cheaply homes in the 1960s or built their homes comparatively cheaply in the 1960s, handed over to their children who have now a very easy way, well, to build on their assets. And I was once involved in a project on inheritance tax. Because it's not only a matter of making it easier for some people to access assets, it's also a matter of redistribution. It's not a very popular discussion, definitely not in the US, but it's a necessary discussion to be had about taxation and the effects of taxation about redistribution. As I said, inheritance tax is one important element of that.
Thanks, Clemens. Kelly, do you want to go to our second to last question? And
Yes,
that means that the answer's got to be brief.
a question from Jade Moss. Regarding Judy's point about the student loan crisis, is there a concern that loan forgiveness on behalf of the US government would incentivize colleges to raise the price of tuition even more? How can we make college more accessible while also holding colleges accountable?
1 minute or less, Judy.
So my 1 minute or less is read the paper I'm writing. But if you look at how the student loan debt is distributed, the problem is for-profit colleges. That's your problem. And so that's really where we should be focusing. And again, the Obama administration did that. The Trump administration reversed it. We're probably going back. So, but I am actually researching and writing a paper on this. So just stay tuned.
Well, maybe Jade is an undergraduate student here, so she could reach out to you.
Yes, she could.
And we have one more question from Andrew Schrank, who's one of our featured presenters at the next Just Wage Forum. He's a sociologist at Brown University, and he has a question for Randy about, can you say something about the tensions, potential tensions within the AFL between obligations to retirees to maximize returns and investment security versus obligations of the labor movement to create more good union jobs, right? So is there tension there over the ability to do both of those things simultaneously?
Absolutely. And I would say so this way, right? One, for every commercial real estate investment fund like the BIT that we create that talks about creation of jobs, both construction and on the operations, there's another commercial real estate investment vehicle that doesn't care about those things, right? So for if I'm an electrical workers retirement fund and I'm choosing between the two, we have to make a decision. Because if you have a certain criteria, and maybe it's just a bottom line one, like Andrew I think is talking about, for how you choose your investments, then this comes into conflict. Now, the professionals who work with these union pension funds know their trustees, and they talk about where they need to be on the return horizon and the like. But these are questions that come up all the time, and they're ones that like I said, at the previous administration, want to put more emphasis on things like questions like that, I should say, in order to make it harder for those who actually care about these things to make those decisions themselves, to make decisions, since they are beneficiaries, to make decisions about what benefits them most, I would say. So yes, there's a tension there, but we still exist, right? So these decisions are made in different ways. But it's on us, I would say, on the side of the ones who work with the managers to make sure that what we are putting out, that the performance is there in different ways and that we're able to document it. We're in the middle of a huge project to get real into the nitty gritty, and Thalia probably is laughing and also crying at the same time because she's been working hard on this to make sure we're documenting every job that our funds are able to create, how that works in that specific region as far as creation of employment, but also for how it works on that local, in building up that area for jobs around it. These are all things that we want to make sure we're putting on the table so that the folks who make the decisions to invest have all that information, are able to make some fair, we think, decisions and balance on it. But it is a constant tension, just how it is.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to call it here because we're at 2:31. I want to thank Professors Fox and Sedmak from Notre Dame, as well as Mr. Randy Kinder and Ms. Thalia Lankin from the Investment Trust Corporation, the AFL-CIO, for the great presentations and the great conversation we've had. Hopefully it won't end. Please continue these conversations at your dinner tables. in your churches, your temples, wherever you congregate, even if it's on Zoom. Thanks to Kelly Reagan and Judy Benchar and others working with us at the Center for Social Concerns. I hope you'll join us. You see on your screen next time, Friday, April 9th at 3 p.m., where we'll focus on the question of Social Security, very broadly defined. Thanks everyone for joining us today, and I hope you all have a nice weekend.